Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in Provence, in France, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Unger, who is somewhere near Lake Michigan, I understand, in the USA. Welcome to the 45th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who's the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button. Do not use the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider towards the end. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that there isn't a bottleneck at the end and that we miss you off. Now, I'm looking forward to this discussion. We have a wonderful panel. I'll hand over to Sandy. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Mike. You're right. I am in the Indiana dunes on the shores of Lake Michigan at this time of the year, and happy to be continuing our series from here. Mike and I have done this for 45 consecutive months now, and we're very pleased to be able to bring this to our friends through thick and thin, whatever the weather, whatever the circumstances. We have a particularly interesting panel today. Anne Lonsdale is a British scholar of Russia and China. She is at Cambridge University and was Secretary General at one point of the Central European University. Stephen Pfeiffer was ambassador to Ukraine, a member of the U.S. Foreign Service. He is a retired Foreign Service officer now. He is at the Stanford Center for International Security in California and also affiliated with the Brookings Institution. So he's a continent away from where some of these decisions are being weighed right now. Howard Robinson, Senior Research Scholar at Blackfriars Hall at Oxford. Howard is a professor of philosophy, and he was provost, I believe, of the Central European University at one point, and is joining us, I think, from Oxford, but and Anne is, I think, in Cambridge, although I'm not certain about that. Yes, and we're also joined by Peter Rona, who is in Hungary today. He was 2 years ago the unified opposition's candidate for president of Hungary. He's had an extraordinary transition in his life. Was a refugee from Hungary in 1956 to the United States, ended up in the UK for many years and is still there now at Blackfriars, teaches economics, was CEO of the First Hungary Fund, and has a great depth of knowledge on these matters as a result of having been in the right place, or was it the wrong place at the right time. Peter, I'd like to start with you, with the central question that this forum poses. What does Vladimir Putin really want? What is his end game here in Ukraine? And we'll talk with everybody in a few minutes about how the stakes have changed, or the chess players have changed recently. But what do you think Putin's ultimate goal is?
Well, I think he made it very clear at the end of 2021 when he announced that he would like to terminate Ukraine's status as a state, as a sovereign nation. He would like to dismantle that. And he would also like to see the post-socialist country of the leave NATO, and for NATO and the United States to agree that those countries belong to the Russian sphere of influence. He formulated that in a diplomatic note, which he delivered to the United States. So it's a written document where he sets out his objectives. Those are his objectives. Now, the objectives actually are less of a surprise than it might seem at first sight. No less a scholar than Zbigniew Brzezinski noted many years ago that long before the collapse of the Soviet Union, that without Ukraine, the Soviet Union and now Russia is not a great power. So if Russia wants to be a great power, it has to, as it were, reconquer Ukraine and terminate the independence of Ukraine. And that is Russia, a very important middle power, subservient to China. So it is a genuine problem from his point of view that he is now addressing. What that objective, however, will not be realized. That is clear. Whatever the outcome of this conflict is, that is not what will happen. What his end game is, I think, is very difficult to tell. How he will undoubtedly, he now undoubtedly knows that this step is much more fraught than he had first imagined. It has extraordinary serious consequences that he cannot control. And how he gets out of this jam is a very, very difficult problem for him and for us as well.
And Lonsdale, we were going to have with us today a former member of the Ministry of Digital Transformation from Ukraine, Gosana Momedieva, who has kept millions of Ukrainians linked to their government and to their society throughout this war. But she unfortunately had childcare issues this morning. She's now at Georgetown University and was unable to be here. So I can't expect you to speak for her, but I would ask, given the depth of your knowledge about this area, how you see whether you see Putin's efforts being foiled by other European countries, which on the one hand are afraid that he might decide to invade them if things go too well or too badly in Ukraine, and what you think about Putin's, does Putin have anything to worry about on the home front? There have been such losses, such casualties among Russian troops.
Well, difficult to say. I'm not sure that I think Putin knows really what he wants, because sometimes he has rather wider, broader statements about the end of the Soviet Union being the biggest disaster of the 20th century. And he seems to wish to rebuild that union. And certainly my last job was in Kazakhstan, and in Kazakhstan, they worried quite a lot about just where Putin's aims might go. And a lot of Kazakhstanis, of course, were very worried when Putin intervened. Helpfully, it turned out, to the Tokayev government last January, but it's a very complicated story there. As for the situation in Europe, thank goodness we've held fast so far, but I do very much fear that the United States will move into an era when there's no hope of getting help to Ukraine, and possibly a wish to get rid of NATO altogether. And I think the recent election of a vice president, or choice of a vice president for President Trump, will not be good for any of us.
Steve Pfeiffer, you spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine. and represented the United States there. How do you, if you were in Ukraine today, what do you think you'd be seeing and hearing?
Well, I think this goes back to Vladimir Putin in a way. Vladimir Putin fundamentally does not understand Ukraine or Ukrainians. There was significant evidence, I think, that he believed when he launched this invasion in February of 2022, that the Russian military would prevail in a matter of weeks, that they would even be greeted as liberators. For example, the Ukrainians reported that one of the convoys that they shot up north of Kyiv in the early days, they found a truck filled with brand new uniforms, dress uniforms, which they assumed was for the victory parade that never took place in Kyiv. But I was in Kyiv about 3 months ago, and Ukrainians, I mean, they're on one hand, they're weary of the war. I can understand that. But they also remain pretty determined. They continue to believe that they can and that they will win. And when you ask them define win, they define that as recovering all the territory back to the 1991 border. Now, that may or may not be realistic, but Ukrainians are pretty determined to continue this fight. And they have been surprising the Russians and the world now for 2 years and 4 months. And I think they may continue to surprise us with their tenacity and their resilience.
One of the factors that has emerged is and who would have guessed this some couple of years ago when it all began, the centrality of Hungary to this circumstance and this situation. Howard Robinson, you're one of 3 people on this panel who have spent some time in Hungary, and Anne Lonsdale just said that she thought there'd been some unfortunate news because of the selection of Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, for vice president. Can you help us put together this puzzle, why Hungary has a central role here? And then I want to go back to Peter for him to explain more about Orban's ideas and roles here.
Well, I was talking to at a college piece not very long ago to a contemporary of mine who was actually served in the British embassy there, I think in the 70s or 80s. And I think he was in the intelligence services, because when I asked him whether he was, he said, that's what people say. But perfect Hungarian, but classicist. But he couldn't believe, and I can't believe, with Hungary's history, how they could possibly have any natural sympathy for the Russians, whom they hated like poison. So it's really a mystery. Now, Hungary, I think, is the only one of the East European countries where the list of the people who were collaborators with the communist regime, informers and all that, has never been released. I think that's right, isn't it, Peter? Now, everybody seems to think they know that Orban's father was very active in that, moving from being a ruthless informer to being a ruthless capitalist. There's stories that Orban was no better off, or Lazar, some of the other people. Now, whether that's got anything to do with it, whether the Russians could actually expose them if they didn't play ball with them, I've no idea. Or it could be just the natural sympathy with a kind of authoritarianism. Why would Trump be interested in Orban? It's the same kind of illiberal populism, nationalism that they all believe in. So how are these various factors break down? I don't know. Can I just add one thing about Ukraine itself? I went through Odessa on a sort of Soros thing. I can't remember what it was. And it was, I think, 2009, when elections were about to take place. All the posters were supporting the Russian-speaking candidates. Now, and that's not quite in the Crimea. That's a bit further along the coast. Now, whether that meant that those were people who really would like to be part of Russia, or whether they were just the Russian-speaking minority, as it were, I don't know. But it was very striking that all the election posters were supporting the Russian candidates. When I asked anybody who spoke English, they said, of course, that's the sympathy. How important that is in the east part of the country, I've not the faintest idea now, or whether they've been put off by what's happened since. I've no idea.
Peter Roner, let's go back to you. And this question of Orban that I think is really quite interesting. Orban is Prime Minister of Hungary. Hungary is now in the presidency of the European Union, and so theoretically hand in glove with NATO, and yet Orban went off to see Putin right after the NATO summit, if I'm not mistaken. So what is Orban's game here?
There is a narrative, a standard narrative, to the effect that Hungary's democracy was derailed by Orban for some mysterious reason. And whether he's under the thumbs of Putin or he's subject to some sort of blackmail or something like that is part of the standard narrative. I do not share that narrative. I think that the explanation of the situation is that in point of fact, Hungary has a very, very weak and questionable democratic heritage. It is not essentially a democratic society. It also suffers from some very serious burdens or complexes, if you like. It has a very weird language that nobody else speaks, nobody understands. It's a small country, and it has no natural friends anywhere in the world. So it feels very, very lonely, exposed, and at risk. Those considerations propel Hungary in the direction of wanting a very strong, powerful leader, backed up by an uncle, an almighty uncle, who will protect them. So the Hungarians will want some kind of a protection, which they, in their experience, in their sense, the collapse, the period following the collapse of the Berlin Wall did not provide them with. Instead, capitalism, the transformation of their societies into Western type economic and social structure has brought to them, has inflicted upon them very serious hardship. There are a lot of very, very poor people in Hungary today, and there are very few very rich people in Hungary. So it's a very divided society in terms of wealth and income. Orban's political strategy is built on this. He's saying, I will take care of you, and I have a granddaddy or a daddy called Vladimir Putin who will back me up. And if he doesn't, the Chinese will. Between the two of them, I will have enough backing to protect you. To that, the Hungarian population, very large part of the Hungarian population says, yeah, right on, fine, thank you. Good, do it. And the opposition has not been able to articulate a response to that. So, whereas, I had a very special situation because I had a certain kind of moral credibility. I was 14 years old in 56. I had a certain participation in the events of 56, despite my very young age. And so I was the embodiment of the tradition of 56 and the tradition of rising up against Russia. And in this very strange schizophrenic way, people deeply respected that. And they considered that to be part of Hungarian tradition, Hungarian heritage, so on and so forth. And at the same time, there is this very deep-seated fear of being alone, being exposed, being abandoned, if you like. It's almost like a child who loses its parent and feels abandoned. It's a sense of abandonment that the Hungarians have, their interpretation of their history is an endless, repeated story of being abandoned, most particularly in Versailles and the Peace Treaty of Versailles, but thereafter being abandoned and being chucked to the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. And And then there come these problems that are partly domestic and partly international, such as the rise of Nazism, fascism in Hungary between the two world wars, which they were unable to cope with. But at the same time, they also felt, yeah, we were unable to cope with it. We didn't really solve it. But did anybody help us? No. So where was England? Where was France? Where was the United States in 1930? Nowhere. Where were they in 1956? Nowhere. And so on and so forth. So that's really the story. So what Orban has put together here is an absolutely genuine, plausible political strategy. It's not some weird, inexplicable thing that cannot be, that must have some kind of a conspiracy explanation. No. From his point of view and from the point of view of Hungary and Hungarian history, it is a perfectly explainable, explicable turn of events. Sad as it is.
I wonder if you, Peter, or maybe with the assistance of some other people, might explain how Orban came to be friendly with a group of people in the United States Senate, a group of Republicans who just happened to include J.D. Vance, who, if Trump is elected president, many are now predicting this, and as vice president, may have some very strong feelings about not helping Ukraine, which some people somehow connect to Orban as well. I don't know whether, Anne, you want to pick up on that, or Howard?
Well, I don't particularly want to pick up on that because I'm not sure about it. But what I was thinking when you were talking, Peter, is about the situation in 1991 when Hungary was out from under Russia and was thinking about its origins. And there were many exhibitions and many articles and many television programs about who the Hungarians really were. And they absolutely repudiated what they said was the Soviet view, that they came from the valley of the Don, and they said that's rubbish. Some of them thought they might be connected with Tibet, others went back as far as Korea, but they certainly saw themselves as definitely not European and never having been well received by Europe. There was a deep strain in 91 already.
Yes.
So,
Howard?
Well, one thing that strikes somewhat surprisingly about what Peter says is this: there is still quite a strong majority in Hungary who are very strongly in favour of the EU.
It's not as strong as you think it is. It's 56%.
Right, but it's enough to.
But it's
not very happy about alienating them. I mean,
but it's a totally money issue. We want to be in the European Union because they give us money. And Orban has very clearly expressed that. He said, yeah, we want to stay in the European Union as long as we are recipients of these funds. When we turn into net contributors, we are going to want to leave. He has said that.
But doesn't NATO go along with that? And don't they feel protected at all by NATO?
No. No, they have grievous doubts about NATO after a whole series of events that they don't feel. I mean, partly to respond to the point that you make, and at the same time to respond to the question that Sandy has raised. Orban, some 6-7 years ago, came very firmly of the view that European Western liberalism is dead. It's finished. No future, no hope. Then the next question is, well, what will replace it? Okay? And he has not really come up with a very persuasive answer to that, even to his own mind. I don't think he quite believes he has the answer to that question. But he says that the rising power is somewhere out there on the east. It's certainly not in Western Europe. So So the answer to the question of what future for Hungary, well, the future of Hungary is in the East. This is why he labeled his program, I guess it was some 6-7 years ago, opening to the East. That was his campaign program, right? Mm. Now he got himself into all kinds of complications along those lines, and he's now in and not in a very good place in many respects, in diplomatic, economic, etc. connections. So he's in trouble with that view. But that is the answer. Now, because he believed that, he also believed that American liberalism is also dead. And who is the most authoritarian political figure in the United States? Well, Donald Trump and his associates. He developed a very close relationship with Steve Bannon, paid Steve Bannon a lot of money. Steve Bannon came to Hungary a number of times to lecture for very substantial fees. And partly through Steve Bannon, also through others. Borka was a close associate of Orbán before he became a member of the White House elite under Trump. He's Hungarian. Through those connections, he built up a wide, broad, and deep connection with the Trump, shall we call it, establishment. And Vance is one of the people who he's very close to. But he's close to the whole gang.
Steve Pfeiffer, if you were if you were in Ukraine, if they asked you what to do at the moment, change possibly coming, dramatic change in the United States, a new government in the UK, some mystery about what the government will turn out to be in France in the months ahead. If you were Ukraine, you might be very worried about what to count upon and what not to do. What's their alternative?
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Sandy, first let me just get back. I mean, the question about the Republican Party and people like Orban. I mean, I actually think if you look at the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, you see both with regards to Orban and Putin, interest in them because one, they like strong leaders and they are prepared to accept more authoritarian leaders. I think there's a certain part of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party that is not that committed to democracy, small d. But also I think there's affinity because they look at people like Orban and Putin and they see leaders who have conservative social values. And I think that has broad attraction to the Republican Party. So you get people, like Trump, Vance, and such, looking to people like Orban and Putin as leaders with which they wish to deal. Now for Ukraine, I guess if I was in Ukraine now, first of all, I would be happily surprised about Europe. 28 months ago, when the Russians launched the invasion of Ukraine, the major invasion of Ukraine, I would not have predicted that Europe would be as steady and consistent and committed to supporting Ukraine as it is. And I am surprised and disappointed that the big question mark now hangs over my own country. And it really does, I think, turn on our election in November. If President Biden or a Democrat is reelected, I think the United States will remain committed to supporting Ukraine. I believe that if Mr. Trump is returning to the White House, that will be the end of American assistance to Ukraine. In those circumstances, I think Europe would continue to try to support Ukraine, but I'm not sure that Europe on its own has simply the defense industrial capacity to provide what the Ukrainians need. So if I were in Kyiv now, and I think you can already see it, President Zelensky, his comments, I mean, he's basically trying to stay out of this election, trying to make clear he would work with whoever the American public chooses to be the next president, and even suggesting, I think, perhaps with more optimism than is justified, is that, Ukraine could work with a Republican administration in 2025.
I would only add to that I understand that Boris Johnson, in his half-an-hour conversation with Trump yesterday, I think it was, made it clear to Trump that if he abandons Ukraine, he automatically also says goodbye to Europe, and made the point to Trump that, look, if that's what you want, fine, that's what you want. But the consequences of that to the United States, both economical, political, and military, are very, very serious, and you need to assess those.
But you presuppose that Mr. Trump understands those consequences. I mean, John Bolton, who was Mr. Trump's third national security advisor, believes that he will take the United States out of NATO. You know, he may not take the United States formally out of NATO, but you know, you can remain a member of NATO and not do much. And I think even Mr. Trump's return to the White House, this is somebody who in February said, if they don't pay as much as I want, tell the Russians to do whatever the hell they want. You know, what does Vladimir Putin in January of 2025, if Mr. Trump is back at the White House, what does he think about the American commitment to NATO?
I think that's a very fair point. I don't disagree with that. I'm just reporting what I
think our concern is who is
I've been told the last few hours what to play. Now, you know, Johnson's argument is that look, be careful. You are talking about a market of 480 million people. That's the European Union, and you add to that another 100 million with Turkey, etc. On top of that, it's a 500-600 million population that you're talking about. You're going to lose that. And if you think that the American economic system is strong enough to lose that market, the richest market in the world, I think you have another thought coming your way. And I think I know that kind of thinking for a Trump presidency is now going around in Brussels. That, okay, he's going to leave. That's not necessarily such a bad thing. We are going to organize ourselves. We will have, if he wants Fortress America, fine. We will have Fortress Europe. And the United States has tremendous technological, industrial, etc. capabilities, but they have that because they won the Second World War, and they saw to it that we Europeans and others couldn't quite develop it in competition with them. So if they want to say goodbye to Europe, terrific. We will have a Fortress Europe, and within 10 years, we will be very, very serious competition for the United States. I think that narrative is going to be permeating American research groups and think tanks and so on and so forth in the months ahead. And what a future Trump administration does with that, I don't know. I suspect John Bolton is probably right. He does know Trump very well. Many of the things he said about Trump turned out to have been correct. So I don't dispute any of the things that you said. I am just saying that the so-called abandonment of Europe by the United States is nowhere near as dramatic and frightening a thing as many people, particularly in the United States and some of the intellectual circles of Europe, believe. If you were the head of Rheinmetall, you would say, terrific, I'm all for it. Get the hell out. And I will build a defense industry that will compete with yours in 10, 15 years.
And you were going to intervene here.
I very much hope that America thinks like that in a way, but I don't think that Europe is necessarily in the position you think it is. Europe is on the edge of much more division. The French election has been a terrible mess. There's problems in Germany. There are problems all over Europe about money. Greece is uncertain. Turkey isn't in Europe and has great problems of its own. I wish that I thought that we could do this, that we could get together as before the Second World War and carry us a long way on our own. But we needed America in the Second World War, and I fear we would need America again in anything that comes ahead. There are huge opportunities, but the countries of Europe are divided. Britain is divided. We're split by the disasters of a conservative government, which has half ruined us. We have no money at all left. We can put up taxes, but we haven't got the money for a huge armaments bill. Our army is too young, too small. We are very nervous about increasing enough to be able to resist aggression towards Britain or any of its members sort of offshore. I think this is much more dangerous than you're saying, much more dangerous.
Howard Robinson, how do you rate the chances of Britain taking a leadership role with its new government, brand new government,
well, I think
that would be taken seriously by Vladimir Putin?
Well, that depends how many troops you can put there and how quickly you can produce your weapons. And I'm really not in the position to answer that. But one thing that I did notice, just by pure coincidence, about 2 weeks ago, I took off my shelves Asquith's account of the genesis of the First World War. And there was something that Gray said to Page, the American ambassador, I can almost quote it, which is very like what people are saying about the Ukraine now. There's a treaty guaranteeing this place. The whole of civilization will collapse if we don't, that place then being Belgium, if we don't defend it. And the Dutch, the Danes and the Swedes are already worried about what the Germans will do next, which is exactly the way the Baltic states and even the Poles to some extent are talking now. So I think a lot turns on what Peter said at the beginning. If we think that all that Russia wants is Ukraine is our breadbasket, we need Ukraine, we've already got Belarus, perhaps we need Georgia, that's the end of it. So if it's, I have no more territorial claims, then should we risk anything defending these countries that are bound to remain very corrupt anyway? Or is this the beginning of an attempt to be a really dominant pan-Slav or, you know, really dangerous in the rest of Europe? And goodness knows. I mean, he's talked as if he did have those kind of broad ambitions at some points. Other points, it may be just they can't function without the Ukraine, and I really have no idea.
Steve,
I think that's a really good question. I mean, you know, almost all analysts now would say, you know, Putin would never attack a NATO country, and they may well be right. But those same analysts, if you go back to 2018 and you'd ask them, would Putin launch the kind of invasion in 2022 they launched against Ukraine? They would have said, oh, that would never have happened. So I think there's a certain risk to underestimating Mr. Putin's ambitions. You know, one, Ukraine is in part about recovering territory that he considers historic Russian lands that were lost when the Soviet Union collapsed back in 1991. But he's also been very clear that he wants to undo the post-war, Cold War security arrangements in Europe, and those are now centered on NATO. Right. So I don't feel comfortable excluding the possibility that if Mr. Putin wins in Ukraine and is thereby emboldened and has a few years to rebuild his military, he might not say, you know, maybe I can get away with something like, you know, Eastern Estonia. And, you know, particularly if he sees the United States walking away from Ukraine, not having lost a single soldier, is he going to think that the United States is going to commit its military power to Estonia? And bear in mind, Putin is somebody who has shown, in particular in 2022, that he is capable of huge miscalculation.
Steve, I want to come back to you in just 1 second, but I also want to remind our participants at a distance that we're coming up to the time when Mike Scott will be taking up the questions from our listeners. So this is a good time to put any other questions in the Q&A. Steve, I don't think we can expect you to speak for the American foreign policy establishment, but it would be an interesting question to ask you, and I'd like to ask Howard the same thing about the UK. What are scholars of Europe, of foreign policy, of international affairs, when they're sitting down, say, at Stanford University or at the Brookings Institution, are they setting the table a little bit differently right now about the agenda for discussion, given what Putin has gotten away with thus far?
I think, you can find a range of views. I think there are a number of scholars, including, a number of my colleagues at Stanford, who feel, I think, quite strongly that the United States should continue to support Ukraine. And that is very much in the U.S. national interest. There are others out there who argue that the risk of conflict, of a broader conflict between NATO and Russia over Ukraine, are so great that the United States should try to push the Ukrainians into a negotiation. I do not share that view. I think thus far you've seen no indication that Moscow is prepared to negotiate in a serious way. In fact, Russian demands have escalated, even though they have not performed that well on the battlefield. So now, in order to get just a ceasefire, Ukraine has to agree to cede territory in Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk that the Russian military does not even occupy. But there's a broad range of views there, and you can pretty much, I think, find any argument that you want.
And before we go to Mike, Howard, British scholars, what are you hearing? I realize this is not specifically your field, but are you what kind of talk are you hearing among university people in the UK? And Anne, I would ask the same question.
Yeah, I really don't mix with people like that. I could tell you about economists, but in British stuff, but not that. I mean, I'm sure people would not mind putting boots on the ground if there wasn't the threat of any nuclear escalation. It's a bit like Hungary 56. I'm sure the NATO powers would have helped the Hungarians in 56, but it's not worth for anybody if it goes nuclear. And so you just raise the odds all the time from the other side and keep making that threat, and you're in an impossible judgment situation. But I don't know what the experts say, and I suspect that they're just like the American ones. They're in the same confusion and uncertainty.
And
I think there's a problem of a self-fulfilling prophecy that every time something lands in Russia from Ukraine, and certainly any time that we got together and actively resisted on the borders with Russia or moved over the borders, then Putin can say to everybody, you see, I told you were being attacked. It's terrible. We're at war. We have to bring everything into this battle against it is an existential question for us. I think it's extremely difficult. I agree about the nuclear point. I am slightly less anxious about it because I think Putin's been around long enough that, unlike maybe Iran or certainly North Korea, he does think it's rather a bad thing to do for society and for humanity. But I'm really frightened.
Well, weren't the KGB bosses a bit scared of him in the old days because he was a risk taker and an unreliable person? That's so. I mean, the old-fashioned communist regime was a good conservative lot. They didn't want to risk anything too much. They were easier to live with.
Yeah, but we've seen that
go
over
ahead,
the last
Peter. Yes, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't think that Putin is in a position to start a nuclear war without some kind of a tacit consent from China. So the answer to that nuclear threat is in relations with Beijing and the formulation of a deal with China, whereby China will exercise its very considerable influence over Russia and Putin on that issue. And I do believe that kind of a discussion or conversation is taking place.
So we're in an ironical situation here that we're dependent on China to protect us from Russia.
Yep. That's right. That's the
I guess I'm less sure on that point. I do think if you look over the last 2 years, the Russians and Putin have tried to suggest that they are prepared for a nuclear risk and that they think they are more prepared than the West is. And I do think there is one true red line, and that is were NATO combat forces to enter the conflict on Ukraine's side. If the Russian general staff, you probably cannot figure out how to win that fight at the conventional level. But below that, I mean, NATO countries are now providing F-16s, long-range strike missiles, and that does not appear to have reached a Russian red line. And I think Putin at one level understands that using nuclear weapons, that opens up a Pandora's box. And the consequences are unpredictable, nasty, and potentially catastrophic, including for Russia. So
I would imagine you would agree, however, that a nuclear move by Putin would not have Chinese support.
I think that's right, and I think in 2022 in September, which is I think was the height of the Russian nuclear threats, I think that they quickly ratcheted down because one, they saw the threats were having no impact either on the Western support for Ukraine or on Kyiv's readiness to continue fighting, but also you had the Chinese and probably the Indians saying, "Don't do that."
Don't do that, right? That is really. I may have phrased it in a way that it was excessive, but that is my point. I think that will stay the point. That will stay to be the case.
Mike Scott, over to you and the questions that have come in from our listeners, viewers.
Thank you. I think it's a very sober discussion, a very good discussion. So thank you so much for this. Victoria Mumford Smith. Hello, Victoria. Kind of you to send in a question. While Putin's invasion and subsequent treatment of Ukraine is unforgivable, the number of Russians who died as a result of World War II was approximately 24 million, by far the greatest number of any countries involved. Is it possible to understand that Russia feels nervous when NATO countries approach its borders? Anne?
I'm thinking of how much of Russia is not really affected by this. When I spent time in Siberia, I spent time on the east coasts of Russia. You are very, very far from being worried about what NATO is doing. I always wonder at what point Russia just splits, and east of a certain point, perhaps, I don't know, on the NSA, it just stops being a big issue. To have to go to war in Europe from that part of the world, they remember the Great Patriotic War very well. I don't think they want to relive it.
Steve?
Mike, can I make 2 points?
Yes, please.
One, just it was not 24. I mean, the Soviet Union suffered horribly in World War II. It was not 24 million Russians who died. It was 24 million Soviet citizens. Yes. And in both Ukraine and Belarus, they suffered proportionally much higher casualties than Russia did. The second point, though, I'd make is Putin concerned about NATO? The Kola Peninsula up in the north there around Murmansk is probably one of the most strategically important areas to Russia. It's where they base their ballistic missile submarines, their strategic bombers, lots of nuclear weapons. The Finns and the Norwegians have said in the last year and a half, the Russians have basically denuded the Finnish-Russian and the Norwegian-Russian border of troops. They're down to 20%. That doesn't suggest that Putin is really afraid of a NATO invasion. I think Putin's concern is not about a NATO invasion. He doesn't like NATO because NATO constrains his freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis what used to be members of the Warsaw Pact. But it's not fear of a NATO invasion.
Yeah. Everybody seems to be agreeing on that.
Yes.
Let me go to another one. Steve Collier. Do you think Trump has any specific action in mind when he says he can end the war in Ukraine in short order? Or is this just political theatre? I suppose we should go to you first, Steve.
Political theater.
Political theatre. Yeah. Everybody agree? Anne?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Do you, as a kind of a corollary to that, do you think that Putin is influencing the American election in a variety of possible ways?
well, I don't know. The answer to the first question, Viktor Orban has written a letter to the heads of state, heads of government of the EU, in which he explained that he discovered in the course of his conversations with Trump in Mar-a-Lago when he visited Trump, that Trump has a well-developed specific plan for bringing this conflict to its conclusion, but he will not announce it until after the election. But he, Orban, is persuaded that this is a good and realistic plan that Trump has. This is what he has written to his colleagues in the EU. Now, I have no way of knowing how much of the plan Orban knows. I have no way of knowing what that plan might be. I would suspect that it is a plan of great pressure on actually both the Ukrainians and the Russians, but more on the Ukrainians than on the Russians. Trump is basically a bully, and the way he negotiates is with the help of threats. So I imagine that his plan is a series of threats addressed to both parties.
Do you agree with that, Howard?
Well, I don't know, but I can well imagine that it would be something like, and I think this is what Peter said, telling to Putin, okay, if you'll agree to take rather less than what you're asking for at the moment, I'll tell the Ukrainians they're not going to get any kind of help from the rest of us unless they agree to it. And hope that will, after a period, become clear to the Ukrainians and to the Russians that's the best way out, given the alternative is fighting on forever and to an uncertain conclusion. So do you think, Peter, it could be something like that?
I think that in order for this thing to work, he has to have a threat addressed to the Russians as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably a stronger threat vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, but there's got to be a component threatening the Russians as well. I think there is an assumption, a widely held assumption, that Russia is in a better position to outlast the conflict, that it has the means and the resources to carry this on longer than the Ukrainians, particularly if the Ukrainians no longer receive any support from the United States and Europe and the others. I am not entirely sure about that. I think it's a big task for intelligence, Western intelligence, to really investigate that proposition. And I don't see that we have sufficient reliable information on that score. I think that Anne is right. Much of Russia is not affected by the conflict in Ukraine, but some of it is affected by the conflict in Ukraine. And I think that while on the surface it seems that Putin's position is very stable, one never knows. It's in the genes of dictatorships that they collapse very quickly out of the blue. So things can happen. I would say that there's another widely held view that the sanctions have worked less well than imagined and hoped, that the Russian economy has done better than it was imagined. Well, the Russian economy is spending 40% of its GDP on the conflict in the Ukraine. 40%. I understand that totalitarian regimes have great ability to foist that upon their population, and the deprivation and the hardships that will cause them be accepted by them. But 40% is a big number, and I don't believe that number is sustainable. As far as Europe being an effective alternative to American support, no, it's not an adequate alternative to American support. And if there is no American support, Ukraine is in a much weaker position than it would be if it had that support. There was a congressional act voting them 60 billion. Not much of it has been used. I would imagine that all of it will be used if Trump wins the election before he is inaugurated. And that will certainly enable Ukraine to carry on for a while. I don't quite concur with Anne's view about the problems in Europe. I think there are serious problems in Europe, but on the other hand, I agree that I am very pleasantly surprised that Europe has responded to this challenge, I think, much better than many people would have imagined that they would. And I think that response in the months ahead is going to strengthen. Le Pen did not win the election. Now you might say, but she did not win the election. She finished third. Orban has been locked out of all positions in the European Parliament just yesterday. He did not get the 14 vice presidents of the European Parliament. He did not get a single one, even though the group that he formed is the third largest group in the European Parliament now, with Le Pen and others of a similar ilk in it. The center held. It's not true that it's unable to hold. It did hold. The People's Party, the Socialists, and the Liberals and some others grouped together and voted Orban out. He's getting nothing in the European Union. So I think that the unity, the European unity, is emerging. It's in better shape than I would have thought it would be at this stage. It's not in as good a shape as I would like. It is not necessarily adequate to the challenge as yet, but it's moving in the right direction.
Okay, any other comments on that? Or on the infiltration of the democratic process? Steve, any danger to that?
I suspect that very much. I mean, Vladimir Putin wants to see Donald Trump back in the White House in January. Now, but I think also the Russians are probably, after the experience in 2016, to the extent that they are trying to influence the American election, they're trying to do it in a much more covert way so that it's not visible.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Cynthia Carreras asks, why is Ukraine's membership application to NATO taking so long for approval?
Well, there's a simple answer to that. NATO is not in a position to accept a country's application when that country is in a war, because that automatically involves NATO in that war under the existing NATO charter. So in order for that to take place, the war has to be finished.
Okay, hope that answers that, Cynthia. Let's go to Claudio Colorado. Sorry, Claudio. Don't you think that Putin is nourishing his ego with the Western fear of, in brackets, nuclear war? He very easily speaks nuclear because he knows that our existential philosophy is totally different from his. But the point is that a nuclear war has no end. So I believe he only uses the nuclear argument, but he cannot really have the intention of using nuclear. We touched on this a little bit before, but perhaps we'd like to say something more about it. Howard, you were nodding there.
I was, yes, I'm not sure why I was nodding, except that we'd talked about it before. Goodness knows how much, I mean, the Hitler type of person would, if I'm going down, everything comes down with me. Is Putin nearly of that mentality or not? We don't want to take that risk. And so I don't know. I'm not the right person to answer that, I don't think, even though I might have been shaking my head in some direction.
Yeah. I might
As
say,
long as you weren't nodding off to sleep, that's all.
No, that certainly wasn't doing that.
I'm not saying that you were. Anne, would you
Just say,
nothing else to say on that question? Stephen? Okay.
I don't. Vladimir Putin does not want a nuclear war. He understands that would have tremendously bad consequences for Russia. What he does want, though, is to people in the West to think that he is more prepared to risk that as a way of intimidating us. And in this case, I think we can choose not to be intimidated. I thought the French response after one of the nuclear threats in 2022, the French response was perfect. It was, we have nuclear weapons too, full stop.
Yeah. I think just to put this into a context, I think everybody would agree that Russia would not come anywhere near winning a conventional war against NATO. Starting a convention. What?
Not now.
You agree? Not now. No. It's not in a position to start a conventional war. It cannot wage a conventional war with NATO. That's a losing proposition for sure. Putin knows that. His answer to that is, yeah, I cannot win a conventional war. Therefore, if it gets to the point where we are facing a conventional war, I will use nuclear weapons. I think the right answer to that from the West is, look, we are going to support Ukraine to the hilt. We don't accept your territorial claims. We don't accept what you have done in Ukraine. And we support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Full stop. We are not interested in starting a conventional war against Russia. We will not start a conventional war against you. We're not going to do it. Okay? Now, so rest assured, there is no, and behave in a way that communicates that the NATO has no intention of starting a conventional war, of invading Russia, bombing Russia, and so on and so forth. That's why the handling and the communication about these long-range missiles that are being supplied to Ukraine and where they can be used and how they can be used is very important. It's a very delicate issue because that's the question about the conventional war and is firing these weapons well into Russia in a way the beginning of a conventional war, or is it really just a defensive measure on the part of Ukraine? So the definition of that is critically important from this point of view. If the West succeeds in persuading Putin and his associates that we are not going to start a conventional war against Russia, no matter what, but we will defend the Ukraine to the hilt, I think the nuclear issue goes away, loses its force, loses its strength, because then they have restated, but not in a radical way, their nuclear doctrine. Their nuclear doctrine today is that they employ nuclear weapons when Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity is challenged. What they have not done, and it's deliberate they have not done that, is whether the towards Ukraine out of Russia or out of Russia when this doctrine is being formulated and expressed, as I have just said, they are talking about Russia being under threat. as long as Russia itself is not under threat, their doctrine says they are not employing nuclear weapons. Now, this doctrine is significant because it's not a question of Putin waking up one day and pushing the nuclear button. No, this doctrine is the one that's the official doctrine that is indoctrinated, employed, taught, etc., in the entire Russian armed forces. This is what they believe. This is the doctrine around which they are organized. So, yeah. So I don't think the nuclear threat is all that great.
Does that mean that if we had our boots on the soil in Ukraine, but never went over into Russia, they wouldn't? We could get away with that. NATO get away with putting troops in, but never move.
Yes, that's exactly what this doctrine says. Yes.
But a lot of the military opinion that I've heard in Britain, at least, is that they can't win the war, they can't stop the attack from Russia without some advances over the frontier. That there isn't a way militarily and tactically to manage by keeping without firing into Russia.
Yeah, well, that is the rub. That is the issue.
Yeah.
And that's why I say that it becomes a very important, extremely important question. What are the terms and conditions under which these weapons can be employed against Russian territory?
And I believe that the military opinion is that this cannot be done.
Yeah. Well, let's be clear, when we talk about long-range weapons that the West has provided to Ukraine, we're talking about missiles that have a range of about 300 kilometers.
Right.
So they're not capable of striking Moscow or St. Petersburg. And then in some cases, it now looks like, well, originally these weapons were provided to the Ukrainians saying you cannot use them to strike targets in Russia. There's been some easing of those restrictions. So, for example, the United States has said you can use certain types of weapons to strike Russian military concentrations over the border in Kharkiv that are getting prepared to come into Kharkiv. And again, the Russians don't like that, but thus far the Russians have not reacted. I mean, if you look at the Russian military actions over the last 2.5 years, I don't think that you can find anything that the Russians have done that they would have not have done for their own purposes, but that they decided to do just because something that the West did.
That's right.
So again, I think if you get even NATO combat troops on the ground, even in Ukraine, if they're engaged, I think that begins to move into a risky area. But thus far, I think, one, the Ukrainians are not asking for NATO combat troops. And what they're asking for are basically the weapons that they can use to arm their own soldiers. And that seems to be below any real threshold for the Russians.
Yes.
Okay, we're coming to the end, and but there is a different slant coming from Christian Demaras, who talks about a lifelong friend who's Ukrainian, who has taken refuge in the United States, but has found that it's too expensive for them to live in the United States. So this lady now has gone to Poland. And she now in Poland sees that the country is regarding the refugees as a pressure on itself. Do you see, our questioner asks, do you see the pressure the refugee situation might place on countries and their citizens as potentially significant enough to shift views of support for Ukraine at government level?
No.
No? Steve?
The short answer is
no. I agree. No, I mean,
I'm fairly familiar with the Polish situation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Everybody agreed on that. No. And
I hope
I think what you have is a couple of specific issues, particularly in the field of agriculture, which are producing a conflict in Poland. But in point of actual fact, Poland has done very well with the Ukrainian refugees. There are over 2 million of them in Poland now. They have eased a very serious labor shortage problem that Poland was having 2.5 years ago. The Polish GDP has much benefited from this. So apart from the isolated question of a certain segment of Polish agriculture, this is a non-issue.
Okay, thank you very much. I must say that Christian also said thank you very much for the event, and what a good event it's been. We're going to have to close it now. May I also say what a really excellent discussion we've had today from you. Do you want to say anything else, Sandy, before I close it formally?
Sure, Mike. Thanks very much. Thank you to everyone on this panel. We are speculating inevitably on some of these matters, and they seem to get more complex every day, given the electoral situation and given Mr. Orban's dabbling in this matter. You all brought very useful information to the table. So thank you. Thanks to our viewers and listeners. Thanks to Georgetown University for its ongoing support of this series now for almost 4 years. We're appreciative to President Jack DeJoy and Vice President for International Affairs Tom Banchoff and many of our colleagues who work on this, including especially John McCabe, the program manager of the Free Speech Project. So thanks for being with us. We'll be back again, I believe it's on August 14th, talking about whether there should be another very current issue that has come up in the U.S. and some other places, whether there should be upper age limits for public service, and are we having to confront that issue as well. So thanks to Mike for all of this and this hard work that you do, Mike, on sustaining our series as well.
Okay, let me draw it to a close then. The next Free Speech Project at the Crossroads, International Dialogue in association with the Future Humanities Project, will be, as you say, Sandy, on August the 14th, the same time, we say 11 o'clock Washington time, everybody else work it from there. So, and it is on whether age or ability matter in public service. So we look forward to that. Cultural Encounters, a series on cultural encounters, that returns on the 21st of October, and there will be a series of 5 or 6, I think maybe even more, talks before Christmas on cultural encounters. That's the 21st of October. Can I just say, yes, thanks to the people at Georgetown, to the president, Jack DeJoy, who I'm sure is in everybody's thoughts following his recent illness, and we hope he'll soon be back with us, fully recovered. Also, Tom Banchoff, who I gather is today somewhere in Wales, where it will be raining, I can assure him, because it always rains in summer in Wales. So when you see this on the recording, Tom, we did think about you. Blackfriars, thanks to John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute at Campion Hall, to Nick Austin, the master of the hall. My thanks also to John McCabe for all the work he does for us. And thank you all who sent in questions, such very good questions. Actually, some of the questions asking basic things, and some of the questions taking on the debate as well. So thank you for being quite honest about asking some basic things that you didn't understand, as well as some of the complex matters as well. And thank you all for attending today. I'm Professor Michael Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until next time, take care, keep safe. Thanks again, everybody on the panel. Goodbye.